class of America. Ensure that seniors are able to enjoy their retirement years without falling into poverty or moving in with their kids. Social Security's modest benefit, around $14,000 a year, now has become the biggest source of retirement for 2 out of every 3 adult Americans, retired Americans. So,
would the senator yield for just a moment?
I'm glad to yield to my friend.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm late. I wanted to share the floor with the chairman of the Health Committee. Madam President, thank you. I heard what you were saying about Medicare, and it just seemed, am I right about this? I mean, I know what some conservative politicians in this town think about Medicare, because you've been through the discussions when they've, you know, when Medicare, well, you weren't here then, of course, but in 1965 when Medicare passed, it was a lot of conservative Republicans that opposed it. And the first chance, I was in the House and you were in the Senate, but the first chance that Speaker Gingrich, with a new Republican majority, had in the mid-90s, they tried to privatize. Remember, Speaker Gingrich talks about it withering on the vine. So am I right here that they tried this Ryan budget, the Republican budget, they tried to privatize Medicare again. Right. The public so rose up against it a few months ago. Is this sort of a backdoor way of going after Medicare? They don't want to acknowledge to their constituents they don't like Medicare, because 90-some% of Americans like Medicare and benefit from it. Is this sort of a backdoor approach to put these limits on spending so it will sort of force the privatization and the unraveling of Medicare and ultimately Social Security and these programs we care about?
Well, I think my friend from Ohio has put his finger on it. Of course it is. It's a backdoor approach because we all want to balance the budget, right? We all want to have surpluses. We don't want to have deficit spending. So it sounds good. We're going to balance the budget. And so most people say, well, that's a good idea. Let's do that, without looking behind this cap that they put in there of this 18%. 18% is a number picked by the Republicans because that would take us back to where we were in 1966 before Medicare kicked in. So it would throttle a backdoor approach as a way of defunding Medicare and also as a way of getting at Social Security, of moving it to privatization, which the Republicans have never given up on. They started under Gingrich. My friend is right. I can remember them talking about privatizing Social Security. They've never given up on that. They can't do it frontally.
Imagine,
but they're trying to do it through the back door.
Senator Harkin, if I could yield again, imagine what would have happened if in 2003 and 4, when you in the Senate with a lot of people, including a lot of Republicans all over the country, just not elected Republicans, if they had when we were fighting the privatization of Social Security in 2005, 2004, 2005, right. Imagine what would have happened if so much of Social Security had been turned over to Wall Street. I mean, just imagine what would have happened if in 2005 all these people would have put all this money in Wall Street instead of in their secure, lockboxed, if you will, Medicare, Social Security fund, where, you know, nobody's missing Social Security payments. People know what they're going to get. It's predictable. It's always there. It always will be. We put it in these private accounts, and there goes the predictability, and there goes the solidness of Social Security, right?
Well, another thing we got to think about, I say to Senator Brown, is this, that what the Republicans are saying, there's a lot of Republicans who don't care if we default. They don't care if we default. In fact, Michelle Bachmann, Congresswoman Bachmann, who is one of their front runners for the presidency, said she would never vote to increase the debt ceiling no matter what circumstance, under any circumstances. Well, as President Reagan said in 1987, it would mean that and veterans benefits wouldn't get their Social Security checks, and that's exactly right. People have to think about this. If we default, that means that all the people who have put their money into Social Security in the past, what we're saying is, you may have put your money in there and guess what, we're not going to pay you. Is that what we want to do as a country? Social Security is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, more than anything in Wall Street's ever gotten. Wall Street can go under. You're right. If we had put in that Social Security in the stock market, it would be in the toilet now. But we put it into U.S. government bonds because it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. And that's why we have to support Social Security. That's why we can't support this cockamamie scheme of theirs that they're trying to do here. I thank my friend from Ohio for pointing those things out. It really is a backdoor assault on Medicare and on Social Security. Now, you know, people are saying about, well, Social Security, we've got to shore up Social Security. Well, it's sound for about the next 20-some years. But looking ahead, yes, we should shore up Social Security. And one good way to do it is to raise the cap on Social Security taxes. Well, right now, the cap is $106,800 a year. What does that mean? That means if you make up to $106,000 a year, you pay into Social Security on every dollar that you earn. If you make over that, you don't. Well, let me put it another way. If you make $50,000 a year, you pay on every dollar you earn into Social Security. If you make $500,000 a year, you only pay on every 20 cents of every dollar you earn into Social Security. Why is that fair? Why is that fair that someone who makes $50,000 a year pays on every dime they earn, every dollar they earn, but someone who makes $500,000 a year only pays on 20 cents on the dollar? You want to shore up Social Security? Raise the cap on payroll taxes. Raise the cap. And that's something that no one's talking about. What are they talking about? Cut benefits. Cut the benefits. Well, we don't have to cut Social Security benefits. In no way. We just have to make it fairer in terms of how we raise the payroll taxes. As I said earlier, the bill before us would require a two-thirds vote before we could even change that. So if we wanted to raise the cap on payroll taxes on Social Security, it would require a two-thirds vote. That means we'd never get it done. That means that, yes, then at some point we'd probably have to start reducing Social Security benefits. So again, as the senator from Ohio pointed out, this is a backdoor approach to dismantling Social Security. Well, Mr. President, the Republicans are rejecting any notion of shared sacrifice. They demand that we dismantle Medicare, slash Social Security, slash education, cut infrastructure, all those things that undergird the middle class. They shred the safety net for the most vulnerable people in our society, as Senator Wyden pointed out earlier. But they insist on shielding the wealthiest people in our society from even contributing $1 to the mess that we're in. Well, lastly, Mr. President, why are so many people here, to pick up on what Senator Wyden said earlier, why are so many people here so obsessed with deficit reduction to the exclusion of the single largest priority we should have in this country, putting people back to work? That's the most urgent deficit that we have, is the jobs deficit. Senator Wyden spoke eloquently about that. Now, my friend from Missouri, Senator Blunt, talked about that too. He talked about private sector employment. Well, something's got to happen to get that moving. It's not giving more tax breaks to the wealthy. That old trickle-down theory, we tried that. It never worked. Never worked. All these big tax cuts that we gave to the wealthy, that happened under George Bush and a Republican Congress. And look what the mess it got us into. We've been losing jobs for the last several years, going overseas with our jobs, put us in a huge budget deficit. I would say that one of the things we need to do now is not to turn a chainsaw on ourselves, but to recognize that the federal government can be a powerful force for stimulating the private sector. Again, one of the things that I think we need to do is to put more money in the infrastructure of this country. We need to rebuild our roads and our highways, our bridges, our sewer and water systems. We've got hundreds of billions of dollars needed to remodel and upgrade our schools all over America. We need a new electric grid, a smart grid. We need to be putting more into green energy. And energy so we won't be importing so much oil into this country. There's only one place that has the power to focus on that, and a large comprehensive way, and that's the federal government. But then people say, well, we can't do that. We can't afford it. We don't have any money. Well, they're right. So there's two ways that we can get these wheels of our economy going again. We can either borrow the money or we can raise the revenue. I would prefer we raise the revenue. There's plenty of it out there. The businesses in America are sitting on over, I've heard anywhere from $1 trillion to $2 trillion that they're not investing. Well, if they're not investing it, I know where to invest it. Let's put it out there, rebuilding the infrastructure of America. Now, that's not the government doing the work. It's simply the government providing the input so that the private sector can go to work. It's not the government. There's not government workers out there that would be building the roads and bridges and highways, that would be remodeling in our schools or building the new electric grid. No, this is the private sector doing it. But we can marshal the forces from the federal government, marshal the power to focus the funds in that direction, to rebuild America, to make it a more energy efficient, a better educated, a more innovative, technologically competent future for our kids and grandkids. And then once we started doing that, then other elements of the private sector will take off, because they will see that we have made a commitment to the future, a commitment to the future, growth of this country, growth, not a dismantling, not a withdrawing, not a shrinking, but as Senator Wyden said, a growth. And once the private sector sees that we have made a national commitment to growth, they'll start investing. How many times do we have to learn that the investment that we've made in infrastructure has spun off into all kinds of private sector entrepreneurship and jobs and new businesses? Or research, the money we put into research and how that stimulates the private sector. Mr. President, how many times have you heard this old Republican line? I hear it all the time. The government doesn't create wealth, it consumes wealth. The government doesn't create wealth, it consumes wealth. I hear that all the time. Well, that's nonsense. Now, just about a month ago or so, Mr. President, I had a hearing before my committee. My committee, the Health Committee, has jurisdiction over the National Institutes of Health. We had the National Institutes of Health in, Francis Collins, who's now the director of it, bringing us up to date on what the NIH was doing. He pointed out something very interesting. Some 20 years ago, we began to invest taxpayer money, your money, taxpayers' dollars, into something called mapping and sequencing the human gene, the Human Genome Project. It became the Human Genome Institute at the NIH. And they began about a 12-year, actually they finished it in about 12 years, process of mapping and sequencing the entire human genome. The Battelle Institute, a research institute, privately owned, not government, based, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in Ohio, did a study of this, to what happened because of that. We invested $3.8 billion in mapping and sequencing the human gene, $3.8 billion. The Battelle Institute said in the last 8 to 10 years, that $3.8 billion of taxpayer money invested in research resulted in over $790 billion of private sector investment. $3.8 billion of taxpayer money, $790 billion of private sector investment. Tell me again that the government can't create wealth? Of course it can, because it can marshal the kind of resources that this sector or that sector or that sector can't do. No private entity could have mapped and sequenced the human genome. Oh, they probably could have, but it would have taken 40 or 50 years to do it. It took the massive power of the federal government to get it done in a short period of time. So again, this is what we ought to be thinking about. How do we create jobs? How do we put people back to work? And I say it's by making sure that we have the revenue that we can to invest. We can invest in our infrastructure. And I don't mean just the physical infrastructure. I mean also the human infrastructure. That means education, job training. Mr. President, I just saw a figure the other day. This year we are spending, of taxpayers' money, we're spending $14 billion this year training Iraqi and Afghanistani security forces. Training. $14 billion this year. Yet here in America, for all of our job training and retraining programs for the entire country, all job training programs, we're spending less than $10 billion. You think the American people think that's wise? But they don't know this. $14 billion in Iraq and Afghanistan to train their security forces, less than $10 billion to retrain our workforce for the jobs of the future. Well, Mr. President, I see others have come on the floor. I'll wrap this up. Deficit reduction is important. I'm not saying it isn't. But it is not the single most important thing right now. The single most important thing is to put people back to work. That will, as Senator White said earlier, start to create the demand. It will spur more private investment as the federal government begins to invest in the future of this country. That's where we ought to be focusing it. Once we get the wheels going again, once we get people back to work and the economy starts to grow, that's when we start to reduce the deficit. To just focus on deficit reduction right now, to the exclusion of putting people back to work, reminds me of when doctors used to put leeches on people who were ill. It only made them more ill because it drained more blood out of their system. And most times proved fatal, as it did to our first president, George Washington. Our urgent, number one priority must be to create jobs and put people back to work. We shouldn't just turn a chainsaw on ourselves. I look at this Republican cut, cap, and kill Medicare proposal we have before us, and what I see is a budget predicated on fatalism. Fatalism and fear of the future. We need a budget that is predicated on hope and aspirations and putting our people back to work. So put the ideology aside, come together in a spirit of compromise for the good of this country to have a balanced package, a balanced spending cuts that will take place in the mid and outer ranges of our years, revenue increases now so that we can take that money and start putting people back to work, rebuilding both the human infrastructure and the physical infrastructure of this country. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to speak.
Just to yield just for a majority or for one of those deals we got to do around here. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the time from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. on the motion to proceed to H.R. 2560 be equally divided between the majority leader and the Republican leader or their designees, and that senators be permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I thank my friend from Texas.
The senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I want to speak in favor of the cut, cap, and balance legislation. I plan to vote yes on Saturday morning to proceed to this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do likewise, but I'd also like to explain why I think that's important. Most of us understand what this bill does. It cuts spending next year by more than $100 billion. These are real savings and not smoke and mirrors. It caps total federal spending as a percentage of the economy, and it puts us on a path to keep spending to 19.9% of our gross domestic product. Right now, our federal spending is at 25% of the gross domestic product. Our revenues are at 15%, roughly, and so there we have a 10% deficit, totaling roughly $1.5 trillion this year alone. And, of course, those cumulative annual deficits make up our debt. Now, approximately $14.4 million. Well, this piece of legislation also links an increase in the debt ceiling to passage of a joint resolution to balance the budget. And this is an important amendment to the Constitution that's being proposed. We have amended the Constitution, I believe, 27 times so far, and this is the process that the framers of our Constitution embodied in the original document to allow Congress and the American people to amend the Constitution as circumstances change. And clearly, it's obvious to anyone who will look and pay attention that Congress has shown itself unable to constrain its spending to live within our means, to spend only the money we have as opposed to money we borrow from future generations. Just as importantly, this constitutional amendment, this balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, is not an extraordinary thing. It may be for the federal government, but 49 different states operate under a balanced budget requirement. I support the cut, cap, and balance legislation because it meets the three primary criteria that I'm using to evaluate proposals related to the debt ceiling. And those three criteria are, number one, we must not default. That's not an option. And I would say we must not also lose the federal government's credit rating, AAA credit rating. Secondly, we must not increase the tax burden on job creators during a fragile economic recovery. This is not just my position. This was the President's position last December when the expiring tax provisions were extended for 2 more years. And third, we cannot resort to smoke and mirrors in the hopes of somehow fooling either the credit rating agencies or the American people that we're serious about the spending problem that Washington clearly has. Cut, cap, and balance earned bipartisan support in the House of Representatives, and I applaud the courage of those who crossed the aisle to support this legislation in the House. I hope that we see a similar demonstration of bipartisan support for this proposal here in the Senate. Now, Mr. President, I know that there are some of our colleagues on the other side who are dismissive of this piece of legislation. I believe the previous speaker, I wasn't here for most of his comments, but I did see his chart, and I think he was just fairly dismissive of this proposal. But the problem is, for those colleagues who are critical of this proposal, my question for them is, where is your plan? Where's your plan? Just to criticize what responsible members of Congress are trying to propose as a solution to a problem when you have no plan of your own is irresponsible, in my opinion. Well, the House of Representatives passed a budget earlier this year, but unfortunately the United States Senate, it's been more than 800 days since the Senate has adopted a budget. 800 days. That's approaching 3 years. When asked, the Majority Leader, Senator Reid, said that it would be foolish for the Senate to pass a budget. I think he was saying that not because he really believes it's foolish to have a budget, but he thought the political advantage to be gained from by attacking the House plan while having nothing to propose on his behalf gained some marginal political advantage. President Obama has ignored his own debt commission for months. And the debt problem, we know that last December his fiscal commission, the Simpson-Bowles Commission, rendered a very important report documenting in sobering detail the debt problem that the federal government has, unfunded entitlements, as well as our tax system, which makes very little sense and makes us non-competitive globally. It's our tax system, our corporate tax system, which encourages, because it makes economic sense, businesses here in the United States to create jobs overseas where it's more efficient, it's cheaper to do so, where it affects their bottom line in a positive sort of way. Why wouldn't we want to encourage job creators to create jobs here at home? By reducing the disincentives and providing an incentive for job creation here in the United States. The President until recently has shown very little interest in that recommendation of his own deficit commission. And then we know the President, when he proposed his own budget in February, this is a budget that was never taken up by a democratically controlled Senate, either in the Budget Committee on which I serve or here on the floor. The President's own proposed budget in February would actually make our debt problem worse, not better. That's why when we had a vote on the President's proposed budget here a few weeks ago, not because our Democratic friends proposed it and brought it up for a vote, but because our side of the aisle asked for a vote on it, it failed 97-0. 97-0. None of our Democratic colleagues saw fit to support the President's budget proposal because they know that it makes the problem worse, not better. Well, the President finally got engaged a few weeks ago, but the problem we still have is we don't know the detail of what the President's proposed solution to the plan is. He will not say publicly in detail what his plan is. And unfortunately, and this is sort of the nature of the beast, all of the negotiations so far that apparently are still continuing are behind closed doors. Behind closed doors. And if there were a grand bargain to be had, I'm confident what would happen is it would be rolled out here on the floor of the Senate or in the House at the last minute without adequate time to review it or to debate it or for the American people to read it and see how it affects them and to give us feedback. We are representatives of a constituency, and the 25 million people I represent in Texas would like to have a chance to read it and then to tell me what they think about it. Well, we know that so far the American people are in the dark about the negotiations, and that is not a good way to do business. That does not help gain public confidence in what Congress is trying to do in dealing with a very serious problem. Well, last week, I believe it was the press secretary at the White House actually said that, quote, leadership is not proposing a plan for the sake of having it voted up or down. I think that's a bizarre statement. I mean, you offer a plan because you believe it offers a solution to a problem, not because of some fear of having it voted up or down. That's, in fact, how our system works. Majority rules. But unfortunately, the President's leadership style is captured perfectly in that statement, and I think it sums up what's wrong with what's happening here in Washington. Well, Mr. President, I want to remind my colleagues of the challenge before us, and it is not the debt ceiling, it is the debt. And those who think that it's not real, I think are just whistling past our fiscal graveyard. Here's what one of the credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, said just this morning, according to Reuters. They said, if an agreement is reached to raise the debt ceiling, but nothing meaningful is done in terms of deficit reduction, the U.S. would likely have its rating cut to AA category. Such a downgrade would have an immediate effect on other securities, as Standard & Poor's said. We would downgrade the debt of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the AAA-rated Federal Home Loan Banks, the AAA-rated Federal Farm Credit System banks, to correspond with the U.S. sovereign rating. We would also, Standard & Poor's said, lower the ratings on AAA-rated U.S. insurance companies, as per our criteria that correlates insurers' and sovereigns' ratings. Well, what would be the impact if these credit rating agencies, which seem to have an oversized influence on our lives, but they are what they are, what would be the impact of them downgrading the quality rating of our national debt? Well, we know that it would yield higher interest rates for American families, for small businesses, and for the United States government. In fact, we know that interest rates are at a historic low now because of Federal Reserve policy primarily, and those low interest rates we may think are a good thing, and they have provided some glimmer of hope for our struggling economy. But if they were as a result of a downgrading of our debt by these credit rating agencies or by a default, which to me is unthinkable, just a 1% increase on the cost of credit that we would have to pay to people who buy our debt, just a 1% increase over current rates would mean $1.3 trillion over 10 years. $1.3 trillion over 10 years. So the discussions about cuts in the billions of dollars are chicken feed compared to what the credit rating agencies could wipe out almost immediately by downgrading our debt. This is what we are risking by not dealing with this problem. This is what we are risking by political gamesmanship rather than trying to work together in a bipartisan basis to solve this threat to our country and to our future. As one economist, Larry Lindsay, wrote in the Wall Street Journal last month, he said if interest rates rose to their historical averages over the next 2 decades of 5.7% from their current rates, he said our cost of borrowing would be $4.9 trillion higher over the next 10 years. So we are left with the obvious question, how can we stop this calamity, this economic calamity? Well, we could pass this cut, cap, and balance plan, or the President or our friends across the aisle could propose something that they consider just as serious and just as credible. But we've got to do it quickly. So this deadline of August the 2nd is one that we should not flirt with, we should not play with, we should not ignore. We've got to deal with it, and we can't just deal with it by raising the debt ceiling, because as we've seen from the credit rating agencies, that doesn't solve the fundamental problem. We need to solve the fundamental problem of unsustainable debt, or our economic future, it will not be one of hope and optimism, as the senator from Iowa was saying earlier. It will be bleak indeed, and it will be our fault. Mr. President, I see my colleague from Kansas on the floor. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Kansas.
it's my understanding I'm recognized for 15 minutes. Is that correct?
My understanding is that senators may speak up to 10 minutes each under the previous order.
I see. Well, at the end of 10 minutes, I might say, ask unanimous consent for additional 5, and seeing the smile on the President's face, perhaps he would be conducive to that request. Mr. President, every generation confronts challenges, and I'd like to associate my remarks with a distinguished senator from Texas. The greatest generation declared victory over fascism and imperialism. Next generation faced down an enormous competition between the United States and its way of life based on free markets, private ownership, and free expression on one hand, and the Soviet Union and its way of life based on central planning and collectivization and police state control on the other, big time. Again, victory belonged to America and the free world. A new generation in America has now come of age since the Soviet system has collapsed. It is a generation that too often, in my opinion, takes for granted the hardship and sacrifice of our forebears. It is this generation that must confront the crippling $14.3 trillion debt and climbing. We have met the enemy, and they is us. The enemy today is our unsustainable debt. That has been pointed out by speaker after speaker on both sides of the aisle. I'm privileged to represent the people of Kansas, and the people of Kansas are rightfully angry over the endless posturing and all of the rhetoric and all the finger-pointing regarding yet another increase in the national debt. That's right, another increase in the debt limit. Here we are again trying to reach agreement, and I wish the President the House leadership well in their current talks. I wish the Senate was engaged. We certainly don't need to kick the can down the road any further. We really are faced with one issue, and that is to rein in spending. Let me point out, in 2 years, the debt limit was raised nearly as many times as it was in 8 years of the previous administration. It should come as no surprise that the American people in general, and Kansans in particular, reject these current spendthrift policies. I, from the first, decided that it was time. I'm talking about the time when we were considering TARP, and we went through that very difficult time when many in the administration, the previous administration, indicated that if you didn't vote for TARP, why, you were taking a very dangerous road. I must confess that if you look in the congressional biographies, they say I'm a journalist. In fact, that is an unemployed newspaper person. But I wrote speeches, and I've written a lot of speeches for my predecessors and in my own behalf down through the years of public service that I have been privileged to have. And it's that old line of somehow or other we have to set our fiscal house in order, not only for us but for kids and grandkids. How many times do we have to say that? How many times do we have to give the speech? I decided no more. During the TARP consideration, I voted no. I remember the time when the administration folks came in to visit with me to convince me to vote yes. I said, can you explain to me what a credit default swap is? I hadn't really heard that term before. They couldn't. They say they didn't have enough time to do that. I just decided no. I opposed the bailouts. I opposed the stimulus. I opposed Dodd-Frank. I opposed Obamacare. And I oppose any increase in the debt limit without real tangible cuts in discretionary spending and meaningful structural reform to mandatory spending. I don't challenge the intent of people who promoted all of these things, but the result has been an incredible increase in our national debt. Remember the line, did you read the bill? When people went back home, faced up to the folks back home, and more especially with the health care bill, and all of a sudden people became aware of the regulations and all the problems, the Katrina amount of regulations that were pouring out of the Department of Health and Human Services. Now it's, have you read the regulations? And if you add up the regulations, for goodness sakes, clear back in 2008, it was $1.78 trillion in cost to the American public. Figure that in regards to the national debt. That's back in 2008. Think what it is today. It's probably twice that amount. So consequently, we really have a problem. Now, since last November, the President has spoken to this issue. As a matter of fact, he's spoken rather continuously at the White House, to campaign rallies. The problem is that there's no specific plan. I know Republicans in the House are getting a lot of criticism for their plan. At least they have a plan. And the cut, cap, and balance, balance plan has received, as I said, a lot of criticism, but at least it's there. And on the other side, we just don't find anything. It's no specific plan at all. We call that in Dodge City, big hat, no cattle. His first opportunity to put words into action came in February. I'm thinking about the President when the White House submitted his budget request, $3.73 trillion that was estimated to add another trillion to the debt. So we had an opportunity at that particular time. Obviously, that did not work. It was defeated 97-0 here in the Senate. Not too many bills get defeated 97-0. And then all of a sudden now we got into the tax situation. And maybe if we just got involved in a little more revenue enhancement, that's what we call it here. It's called taxes back home. That's not the problem. Taxing is not the problem. It's spending money that we don't have. In May, the President's budget, as I said, was defeated, and rightly so. So here we are, more than halfway through the calendar year, 2 months away from the end of the fiscal year, still no budget from this body, over 800 days. Meanwhile, we have met the $14.3 trillion debt ceiling, and it's climbing. rather than make meaningful cuts and meaningful reforms, specific reforms, the White House and some in the Senate want to increase the debt ceiling again. Again, we have met the enemy and they is us. 14.3 trillion. It's a sum so large that it's difficult to understand. Kansans who I visit with and who call my office express shock that we have allowed to get to this point. How did we get to this point? And then if in fact we don't do anything and we kick the can down the road, what does it mean in regards to, as the senator from Iowa pointed out, the faith and optimism in our country? What does the future hold for a country that acts this way? In fact, paying down the debt should be bipartisan. What would Presidents Truman and Eisenhower say of a $14.3 trillion debt? I think they'd be pretty harsh. All of them have, both presidents have pretty tough quotes in regards to fiscal responsibility. What we need in this chamber, what we need in Washington, is a very strong dose of common sense and a sense of purpose, as evidenced by previous presidents when they put leadership first. Now, here are the facts. They're stubborn things. They're clear. We borrow 40 cents for every dollar we spend. A lot of people hear that. That's climbing. It's going to be 41 here pretty quick. There's a lot of talk about tax breaks for corporate jets. Boy, am I tired of that. And I'm tired of this whole class warfare stuff in regards to saying if we just applied taxes to a certain small segment of the economy, or maybe a big segment like oil and gas, the bad guys, the fat cats, boy, if we get them, we can sure solve the problem. Let's take corporate jets, which I would emphasize represents general aviation. It's called general aviation because the general public uses it. It isn't all Hollywood stars. It isn't all of the rich people using these so-called corporate jets, general aviation. It's the people who have to get there from here because you can't. 90% of our airports, a commercial flight doesn't land there. What if you have a plant? What if you are a manufacturer? What if you're a farmer? What if you're a rancher? And you have to visit several places in the country at one time, say 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 30. That's what general aviation is all about. As a matter of fact, in the stimulus, the President recommended an extension of the same tax depreciation schedule now that he is blaming the fat cats in regards to corporate jets are taking advantage of. That's nuts. I mean, what the left hand giveth, the left hand taketh away in regards to a class warfare speech. We make these jets in Wichita. They're great airplanes. And they service the general public for the public good. According to Charles Krauthammer, the renowned columnist, if you collect the corporate jet tax every year for the next 5,000 years, you would cover only 1 year of the debt that the President has run up, 1 year. I mean, the general aviation industry will persevere, but we've come through some tough times. We're coming in on a wing and a prayer. That old World War II song that's almost revered. And so we will persevere. But can't we end this class warfare business? My Lord, he talked about it 6 times in 2 paragraphs. As I say again, the same industry that he tried to help in the stimulus, and that was the right thing to do at the time. Every cent of taxpayer money is used to pay for entitlement programs and interest rate and interest payments on the national debt. All discretionary spending is borrowed. That's where we're headed. That's where we're at. On average, we accumulate $4 billion in debt each day. It would cost each citizen $46,000 to pay the debt off. That means a family with a husband, wife, 2 kids would owe $184,000. That's rather startling to Kansas families. They don't have that kind of money. I know that perhaps some would say that's apples and oranges with the function of government and the function of families, but it's a good illustration. We've gone over 800 days, I think it's 810 now, without a budget in the Senate of the United States. During that time, this country has spent $7.3 trillion. We spent $439 billion in interest on the money we borrowed. We don't have regular order. If Robert C. Byrd was here today and was sitting in that chair, he would be appalled. He would be making a speech in louder terms than I am, with short, jerky sentences. and he would point out that we're not doing our duty. Used to be that we would have a budget, then we have appropriation bills, and then we would have the committees of jurisdiction meet those budget demands, meet that number, and then we would debate it on the floor. Members would have an opportunity to bring amendments, and that's how we worked. We don't work that way anymore. No regular order. What we do is we bring up huge bills like Dodd-Frank and like the health care bill, usually conducted in private. And then we're voting on it. And then the American public says, have you read the bill? Then they say, have you read the regulations? We've got to restore regular order and restore the Senate back to the Senate. People are fearful. The American public is fearful today. They have a real conscientious worry that America is not the same as it used to be, that they enjoyed, that they want their kids and their grandkids to enjoy. Why is that? Because I think the American dream is that every American youngster can climb on the ladder of success as fast and as high as he or she can with nothing government-made or man-made in their way, regardless. You may stumble, hit your chin on a couple of rungs, but by golly, you get back up and you go right up. Not anymore. Not anymore. We have apparently a national agenda to level everybody with everybody else. It's called social justice. Nothing wrong with social justice, except if it's an agenda to affect everybody. We have now the President of the United States deciding who's rich. Doesn't make any difference if a person didn't make anything one year, makes $250,000 next year, he's rich, despite his or her circumstances, family circumstances, or anything. We have the national government, the federal government, deciding everything. Light bulbs, what you eat, rural fugitive dust. When a grain truck goes down a gravel road in Kansas, and by golly, we have dust, and we have the EPA worried about it. No kidding. We have navigable farm ponds now. The farm ponds declared navigable waters. No self-respecting duck would even land there. We have regulation after regulation after regulation. I can't talk to any manufacturer, any business, anyone in Kansas where I have the privilege of speaking without somebody raising their hand and saying, Pat, what on earth are you doing back there passing all these regulations that really don't make any sense or about to put me out of business? And my reply to him is, I'm not a you guy, I'm an us guy, and boy, I'm sure trying to do something about it. I do have a bill on that, by the way, and I encourage my colleagues across the aisle to take a look at it. I'll be talking to you personally. The rate we're going, in a few short years, we'll spend more paying interest on the debt than all discretionary spending outside defense. Now, Mike Mullen has said that this is the biggest threat to our national security, $14.3 trillion. He's right. And his comments echo the calls I receive every day from Kansans. There's a lot of rhetoric going on here now, and I understand that. Perhaps I've added to it. If I've offended somebody, I apologize. But let's all take a deep breath if we can. Debate and posturing is nothing new in this body or in American history. In the earliest days of our republic, it was between Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists on one side and Thomas Jefferson and his allies on the other. The enmity between these men was so obvious through vitriolic rhetoric, much of the mudslinging that occurred then would be considered out of bounds by today's standards of political discourse. Well, the debate raged on between the early parties over the drafting of the Constitution. It seemed possible that the great American experiment would be over before it even began. Edmund Randolph wrote to George Washington, who at that time had retired to private life, begged him to rescue America from the impending ruin. Washington rose to the occasion the way a leader does. He did it for his country, for his fellow Americans. He showed leadership because it was the right thing to do. And in the end, a compromise was reached. Yes, it was a compromise. And to have the Constitution drafted by the Federalists, but with the Bill of Rights included as drafted by the Jeffersonians. Later, after being elected our nation's first president, Washington was dismayed over the continuous bickering between Hamilton and Jefferson, not so much different than we're doing today, over a wide range of issues: how to interpret the Constitution, the powers of Congress, the relationship between the states and the federal government, the public debt. Even then, sound familiar? Well, amidst the feuding, George Washington wrote to Jefferson and said this: "How unfortunate and how much is it to be regretted that whilst we are encompassed on all sides with avowed enemies and insidious friends, that internal dissension should be harrowing and tearing our vitals." Man, that's pretty tough. That's a bottle we ought to drink from every morning and stop to think about it. Since our founding of our nation,
The senators
the world
have
over,
spoken for 15 minutes.
I ask unanimous consent that I may proceed for 2 additional minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Since the founding of our nation, people the world over have looked to us as a beacon of light because of our freedoms. Others have watched the great American experiment with a perverse hope that it fails. We can only fail if we fail ourselves, if we fail to balance the budget and bring down the debt. America has always proven itself. We will meet any challenge and confront any enemy. The enemy before us is our own fiscal irresponsibility. It is time to stop talking. It is time to start doing. It is time for the President to come up with a specific plan. And in meeting with Republicans and Democrats in the House and the same in the Senate, let's do our duty. In some of the toughest early debates in our country, Americans were fortunate to have steady leadership in keeping a hand on the wheel. I hope members of this chamber and the current President of the United States can look to character, to leadership, to love of our country, to guide us through these very trying times. Every generation confronts a unique set of challenges. The challenge we face today is the $14.3 trillion debt and growing. I am so hopeful that we can close ranks and confront this enemy. We owe the American people and our forebears no less than victory in this fight. I yield back, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent to speak for 15 minutes as though morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, we've spent a considerable amount of time discussing the debt and the deficit crisis this country is facing during the 112th Congress. Although we have heard from the President that we must raise the debt limit, neither he nor any of his Democratic colleagues, with the exception of the 3 senators and the Gang of 6, have presented us with a concrete plan to rein in spending and get our fiscal house in order. Meanwhile, every day we're spending more money that we don't have. While my Democratic colleagues continue to talk about the need to increase the debt limit and get our fiscal house in order, the House of Representatives has taken concrete action to make that happen. On Tuesday night, 234 members of the House of Representatives joined together to pass the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act. The bill will put the country on a sound fiscal course at the same time that it gives the President $2.4 trillion in additional borrowing authority that he's asked us to provide. The problem we currently face is that we're spending too much money and borrowing too much money. I agree with our colleagues in the House that it only makes sense for us to increase the borrowing authority if we put the country on a path where that borrowing will eventually end, even though it's a long way out. The Cut, Cap, and Balance Act takes a 3-tiered approach to finding the right fiscal ship. First, it provides some substantial but reasonable cuts to spending immediately. The bill requires us to cut about 3% in spending from the bloated federal budget next year. That cut amounts to more than $100 billion in spending next year. The bill allows the House and Senate to determine where those cuts are most appropriate, and because we recognize the need to cut in appropriate areas, the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act ensures that there are no immediate cuts to Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, or military salaries. At the same time we cut spending, the bill puts in place spending caps that prevent us from spending above a specific amount and puts our spending trajectory on a path where we can achieve a balanced budget. We all wish that we could balance the budget tomorrow, but we're spending money at such an alarming rate that it just isn't achievable. We're almost borrowing as much money as we take in revenue. The bill recognizes that fact and gradually caps spending so we can achieve balance. Finally, the bill gives the President the ability to borrow an additional $2 4/10 trillion he's requesting, subject to one condition, that Congress passes a balanced budget amendment. We all agree that we need to stop borrowing so much money. The only way to stop borrowing is to have a balanced budget, not spending more than we take in. We have a pretty good idea how much is coming in, how much is going out. That's why August 2nd is this day of crisis. And that's including the money that we borrow. And when we pay the interest, we have to borrow 40 cents on every dollar to pay the interest. If you have a maxed out credit card and you borrow to pay the minimum balance, do you think you'll ever pay that card off? Not a chance. That's the situation we're in. A balanced budget means that we won't spend money we don't have. Therefore, if the President wants to borrow $2 4/10 trillion more dollars from countries like China, we need to know that it won't force us to borrow money forever. Cut, cap, and balance does not ask for the time for states to ratify a balanced budget amendment after it passes. Their time to ratify gives us time to get where we need to go. Like families across America, we're going to have to decide what spending is essential. Families have as many ideas for spending money as the federal government does, but they know that it's not an option to spend what they don't have. They have to decide what's essential and what's nice to have. I think it's important to take a look at the problem we're facing. If you grasp the size of the problem, you'll share my sense of urgency that we must pass the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act. Our national debt is around $14 3/10 trillion. Our national debt's almost equal to the whole economy of the United States, everything that's produced and sold in the United States. Our debt is almost equal to the whole economy of the United States. We call it GDP. That's so you don't really know what we're talking about. That means that if we were to pay off the debt, every man, woman, and child in this country would need to write a check for more than $46,000. It'd be one thing if that number were projected to decrease or if there were signs that we're making progress in bringing our budget back into balance. But that's not happening. Since the President took office in 2009, our national debt has increased by more than $4 4/10 billion each day, for a total increase of $3 7/10 trillion. I can already hear the President counter that he had a lot to clean up. At what point, when things are getting worse instead of better, is the President going to take ownership and provide a solution on paper? Lots of speeches, no paper. The stimulus didn't work, so let's not repeat it. If you keep doing what you've been doing, you shouldn't be surprised when you wind up with what you already got, the same result. Now, Margaret Thatcher, when she was Prime Minister, proved that putting the fiscal house in order increased the economy. They already tried some of the other things, but putting the fiscal house in order is what made the difference. In 2011, we're expected to spend $3 6/10 trillion. At the same time that we spend the $3 6/10 trillion, we'll have revenues of $2 2/10 trillion. That's a $1 4/10 trillion deficit. If we follow the President's budget, we'll have a deficit the next year of $1 2/10 trillion. The 10-year average, if we follow the President's budget proposal, is nearly $1 trillion in deficits each year. After his first term, the President's policies are expected to add almost as much debt held by the public as all the presidents in the history of the United States. That level of deficit cannot be sustained, and contrary to the opinions of my friends on the other side of the aisle, we cannot tax our way out of this problem. Failure to live within our means doesn't warrant taxing the taxpayers for Washington's failures. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the top 20% of income earners paid almost 86% of all federal taxes in 2007. Those individuals are the job creators in this country. Many of them are small businesses who reinvest their profits even though they have to pay the taxes on them at that time. So they put the profits back into their businesses to make them grow. Increasing taxes at a time of economic struggle will cost jobs and will lead to more unemployment and higher deficits. Businesses are already reluctant to expand because of the increasing and detrimental regulations coming out every day of this administration. Some of the regulations aren't even from current law, so they'll be fought in the courts and they'll be overturned, but it'll be at a great expense, a great delay, because it will take over a 5-year period to do that, and we'll experience more pain than any cuts that we might make. Now, rather than increasing taxes, we need to cut spending and reform entitlement programs. Mandatory and entitlement programs now account for 62% of all federal spending, and that number continues to rise as the baby boomer generation retires. By comparison, mandatory and entitlement programs accounted for 33% of all federal budget spending in 1964, 33% up to 62%. The numbers don't lie. Entitlement programs are placing a stranglehold on our budget, and yet there are still calls from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to keep them as they are. Misinformation from campaigns of outside groups say there isn't a problem, and we can fix our budget simply by cutting earmarks and finding waste, fraud, and abuse. That's just not true. Even if the money from the Social Security Trust Fund that has been spent were returned, the length of time a person now lives makes the fund actuarially broke. These problems are too serious for us to ignore. Erskine Bowles, the co-chairman of the Deficit Commission, said it best when he testified that, quote, "We are facing the most predictable crisis in our nation's history," end quote. Everyone knows that we need to take action. Everyone knows that we need to make the tough choices necessary to right our fiscal ship. And yet there are some who suggest that we should not act, or that we should wait to act. To those members, I say that we've kicked the can down the road long enough. It's time for us to take serious action to change the trajectory of our spending habits and get this country in a condition that we can be proud to leave to our grandchildren. We've known that this debt limit debate was coming for months. We can all see that the government is spending money at a rate that will require us to authorize the Treasury Department to borrow more money. Although the date shifted, the fact that the government will breach the debt limit should come as no surprise to anyone. That's why it's so perplexing that the President and my Democratic colleagues have not presented any written plans to get the country back on track. Well, I guess the President did present one, and we voted on it, and it didn't get a single vote in this chamber. Not one vote. He didn't even talk one Democrat into voting for it. He had an outstanding opportunity to talk about the deficit crisis that the Deficit Commission pointed out. He could have done that in the State of the Union speech. He could have followed that up with a budget that would have mirrored what the Budget Commission said. That's kind of where this gang of six is right now with their suggestion. But that didn't happen. Instead, we move on to the crisis and figure that just raising the debt limit will solve everything. We've known it was coming for a long time, and in the House, Republicans passed a budget that would cut the spending by $5 8/10 trillion over the next 10 years. Senator Toomey and Senator Paul in this body presented their own budgets that would get our country back on track. Those were defeated. Senator Corker has introduced legislation that would cap spending levels and head us in the right direction. I've introduced legislation that would require us to reduce spending by 1% for 7 years and cap spending each year to balance the budget. It'll work in 7 years, 1%. Incidentally, that's probably how long it'll take the states to ratify the balanced budget amendment. If you're saying we can do it without a balanced budget amendment, you should also pass my 1% solution bill and prove that we can. A backup plan is always a good idea. Most businesses in the United States have to find a way to reduce spending by 1% to match the economy or to do the regulations we force on them. Most families have to find a way to spend 1 penny less out of every dollar or face a financial crisis. Why can't the United States do 1%? 1% each year. By making the 1% spending cut, we'd save around $7.5 trillion over the next 10 years. Balance our budget, and we put the country on a sustainable spending path. Republicans have offered all of these plans, and we continue to hear only silence from the other side. The only plan presented by the majority, as I mentioned, was President Obama's fiscal year 2012 budget, which was unanimously opposed. When the president and the majority don't lead, some bill has to take the lead. Members of the House proved that on Tuesday night by passing a plan that allows the president to have his debt limit increase and get our country back on track. The Cut, Cap, and Balance Act is a responsible solution to the problems we face. We are spending too much. Too much spending leads to too much borrowing. To rein in spending, we must make immediate cuts that prove Congress can act, and we must cap future spending to ensure that our spending levels do not grow at an unsurmountable level. To prevent future borrowing, we need to put in place a mechanism that will require us to balance the budget. 49 states require a balanced budget, and it's well past time for the federal government to show the same fiscal restraint. The President's asked us to give him the ability to borrow $2.4 trillion more dollars. That's $2.4 trillion that our children and grandchildren will have to pay back, and if the crisis worsens, it'll move up to the current generation. It's money that we'll need to borrow from countries like China, who are our competitors in the world and who do not necessarily share the same values. I don't take that responsibility lightly. This responsibility requires immediate action to correct the problem and prevent future generations from having to make the tough choices our out-of-control spending has forced us to make. The House took the responsibility seriously and passed the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act to right our fiscal ship. At the same time, we give the President the borrowing authority he so desires. The United States Senate should follow suit and pass the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act immediately. I yield the floor.